There's a hidden pattern buried deep within 575 years of financial history, a pattern so precise it has destroyed every empire that ever believed its money was immortal. From Portugal's golden coins to Britain's paper empire, every global currency has marched through the same 8 stages, from dominance to decay, from wealth to ruin. And today, the United States dollar stands at stage 6, the exact moment when confidence breaks, when allies turn away, when power begins to slip quietly through a nation's hands. Yet America believes it's different, stronger, untouchable. But history never bends to belief, because this isn't prophecy or theory, it's mathematics, a sequence that has repeated 5 times before and is repeating once more in real time. Empires don't fall when their armies lose wars. They fall when their money dies. And when it does, everything built upon it follows. Subscribe before the pattern repeats and before another empire learns it the hard way. To understand how empires rise and collapse, you first need to understand the single greatest advantage any nation can ever possess: the power to issue the world's reserve currency. It's not a weapon or an army. It's not land or resources. It's the ability to print the money that every other country must use to survive. A reserve currency is the bloodstream of global trade, the language that every deal is written in, the lifeline that keeps nations connected. When your currency becomes the world's reserve, you don't just control your own economy, you quietly control everyone else's. Every country must hold your money to buy oil, gold, wheat, copper, steel, everything. They can't trade without it. They can't function without it. And that constant demand gives you the kind of power kings once dreamed about. You can buy the world's goods not with labor or production, but with paper, ink and digits accepted everywhere as wealth itself. You export paper, and they export products. You export inflation, and they import debt. You live beyond your means, yet your currency grows stronger because the world needs it more than you do. It's the most brilliant illusion ever created. While others work for wealth, you print it. While others save in your currency, you quietly dilute theirs. And because global trade depends on you, even your mistakes become someone else's burden. You can run deficits without collapse, borrow without limit, and wage wars without worrying about who will pay the bill. The cost is spread across oceans, absorbed by every nation forced to hold what you create from nothing. That's the invisible empire, an empire not built on conquest, but on confidence. It doesn't need armies to march or fleets to sail. Its weapon is trust, and its fortress is belief. For 80 years, the United States has ruled through this privilege. The world needs dollars, so America prints them. The world trusts dollars, so America spends them. The cycle feeds itself, generation after generation, until people forget that privilege is not permanent. Because history has never allowed it to be. Every empire that held this power thought it was eternal: Portugal, Spain, the Dutch, the British, and all of them fell the moment the world stopped believing in their money. The pattern never spares its champions, because the same privilege that builds empires always destroys them in the end. The story begins on the edge of Europe, in a kingdom so small it barely appeared on the map. Yet from its shores, Portugal set out to rule the world. In the mid-1400s, Prince Henry the Navigator launched fleets into the unknown, carving new trade routes along Africa's coast and across the open sea. Within a few decades, Portuguese ships were bringing home gold from Africa, spices from India, and silver from Brazil. For the first time in history, a single currency, the Portuguese real, was being accepted across continents. It was backed by real wealth, by ships, gold, and discovery. Stage 1 of the pattern had begun: dominance through exploration and trade. But success bred ambition, and ambition demanded expansion. Portugal tried to control an empire that stretched from Brazil to India, from Africa to the Far East. A nation of barely 1.5 million people was now defending routes across 3 oceans. The cost was staggering. Soldiers had to be paid, forts built, fleets repaired, enemies fought. Stage 2, overextension, had quietly begun. The profits of trade no longer covered the cost of empire, and deficit spending became the new way of survival. They borrowed from Italian bankers, mortgaged future shipments, and sold tomorrow for today. Then came the fatal decision: debasement. To cover the gap, Portugal began mixing copper into its gold and silver coins, turning solid wealth into illusion. Merchants noticed the change. Trust began to fade. Prices rose, and the coins that once ruled the seas were no longer welcome in foreign ports.
By 1530, inflation had gutted the empire from within. The world stopped trusting Portuguese money, and confidence, the invisible foundation of every currency, was gone. Spain, with its mountains of silver from the New World, stepped in to replace it. In less than a century, Portugal's monetary empire was over. The world's first reserve currency had collapsed, and the pattern, the 8-stage sequence of dominance, debt, and downfall, was written for the first time. It would be repeated again and again by every empire that followed.
When Portugal's empire began to fade, a new power rose from the west. Spain had conquered the Americas, and beneath its soil lay unimaginable wealth. From the mines of Potosi in Bolivia and Zacatecas in Mexico, rivers of silver flowed towards Seville. By the mid-1500s, half the world's silver came from Spanish lands. The Spanish dollar, pieces of 8, became the currency of global trade, accepted from China to Africa. It was a real silver, heavy, pure, and trusted. Spain had reached stage 1 of the pattern, dominance built on endless wealth. But as every empire learns, wealth is never enough. Silver gave Spain confidence, and confidence turned to arrogance. They fought wars across continents, against the Ottomans, against France, against England, against their own Dutch subjects. Stage 2, overextension. Spain's armies marched in 4 theaters at once. Its fleets patrolled 2 oceans, and its treasury bled faster than silver could fill it. Despite importing 200 tons of metal each year, expenses soared beyond control. By the 1560s, Spain entered stage 3, deficit spending. The empire borrowed from Italian bankers, German financiers, and local merchants, promising repayment in silver that had not yet been mined. But the more they borrowed, the deeper the hole grew. And then came the fatal answer: debasement. Mints began mixing copper into the silver coins, cutting purity in half, while keeping the same stamp of value. To the naked eye, nothing changed, but trust vanished overnight. Stage 4 led straight to stage 5, inflation. Prices across Europe surged as the flood of diluted money poured through markets. Food, goods, and labor doubled in cost, while the silver itself lost meaning. Merchants weighed every coin, testing what used to be unquestioned. Confidence, the one thing money depends on, was gone. Between 1557 and 1647, Spain declared bankruptcy 4 times. 4 collapses in less than a century. By 1640, the empire's silver might still have glittered, but it was no longer power. It was poison. The Dutch guilder rose in its place, stable, trusted, modern. Spain's empire of silver had turned to dust. The pattern had repeated. Different flag, same fate. When Spain's empire began to crumble under the weight of its own silver, a smaller nation quietly built an empire of paper. The Dutch Republic, newly independent and fiercely ambitious, discovered a different kind of power, not mined from the earth, but printed in ledgers. They had no gold mountains or silver veins, but they had ships, trade, and the most advanced financial system the world had ever seen. In the early 1600s, Amsterdam became the beating heart of global commerce. The Bank of Amsterdam guaranteed stability, the Amsterdam Stock Exchange turned wealth into investment, and the Dutch guilder, steady, reliable, and trusted, became the new global reserve currency. Stage 1, dominance through innovation. Trade routes stretched from the East Indies to the Caribbean, and the Dutch East India Company became the world's first multinational corporation, its fleets moving more cargo than entire kingdoms combined. But prosperity bred confidence, and confidence bred expansion. Stage 2, overextension. A nation of barely 2 million people tried to maintain trading posts on every continent, defending sea lanes from pirates and rival powers. Wars with England and France drained their coffers. The cost of protection began to exceed the profits of trade. Stage 3 followed, deficit spending. The government borrowed from private banks and foreign lenders, stacking obligations that only made the illusion of wealth last a little longer. Then came the silent danger, credit expansion. Instead of debasing metal, Dutch banks simply lent more than their reserves could cover. The money supply grew faster than real productivity, and inflation crept in like a slow tide. By 1700, prices in Amsterdam were rising, and trust was quietly slipping away. Stage 6, loss of confidence. Britain was industrializing, its navy expanding, its economy surging ahead. The Dutch could feel it, the shift of gravity. Their ships still sailed, their banks still lent,
But the world's attention had already moved westward to London. Stage 7, alternatives emerging. The pound sterling became the preferred currency of trade, and slowly, almost gently, the guilder's dominance faded. There was no great collapse, no sudden crash, just silence. The world changed hands without a single cannon firing. The invisible empire had fallen, not with war, but with time. The pattern had repeated again, quietly, precisely, inevitably.
By the early 1700s, the center of gravity had shifted again. London replaced Amsterdam as the capital of global finance, and the British pound sterling became the currency of the world. Backed by industry, innovation, and empire, Britain entered stage 1, dominance through power and production. The Industrial Revolution transformed a small island into the workshop of the world. Coal, steel, ships, and textiles poured from its factories, and British merchants carried them to every corner of the planet. The Royal Navy ruled the seas, enforcing trade routes that connected colonies across Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Every transaction, every contract, every shipment priced in pounds. But success has a cost. To maintain control of a quarter of the world's land and population, Britain spent beyond its limits. Stage 2, overextension. Soldiers and sailors were stationed across continents, fortresses built, fleets expanded. The price of empire grew heavier than its profits. By the late 1800s, other nations were rising. Germany, the United States, Japan, and Britain began borrowing to defend its dominance. Stage 3, deficit spending. Debt became permanent, justified by power, hidden behind pride. Then came the test that would expose the illusion: war. In 1914, Britain entered World War I, spending £50 billion, borrowing from America, selling assets it had taken centuries to build. The cost was unimaginable. When the war ended, the debts remained, and Britain faced a choice: tighten the belt or print the money. Stage 4 began: monetary manipulation. The country abandoned the gold standard, returned to it briefly, then abandoned it again. Each shift weakened the pound's credibility. Stage 5 arrived in the form of inflation. Prices rose, wages stagnated, confidence waned. By 1944, Britain was fighting a second global war it could no longer afford. The empire that once financed others now needed financing itself. At Bretton Woods, the world gathered to decide the future of money, and chose the dollar. Stage 6, loss of confidence. The pound, once untouchable, was dethroned. Stage 7 followed swiftly. Alternatives emerged. America's gold reserves and industrial might made the dollar irresistible. And by the 1970s, the pound's reserve status was gone. The empire that borrowed its future had finally spent it. The sun that never set had gone dark, and the pattern had completed its course once again. When Britain's empire began to fade, another power rose to claim the crown. In 1944, as the world lay in ruins, delegates gathered at a quiet hotel in Bretton Woods to build a new financial order. The United States held 2/3 of the world's gold, half of its GDP, and the only currency still trusted after a decade of war. The dollar became the foundation of a new age. Stage 1, dominance through unmatched economic strength. Gold backed it, trust anchored it, and nations everywhere tied their fates to it. But power breeds overreach. Within decades, America had stretched across the planet, bases in 80 countries, fleets in every ocean, and commitments that no budget could sustain. Stage 2, overextension. The Cold War, Korea, Vietnam, the Middle East, each mission justified by security, each war paid for with debt. By 1971, the costs had grown unbearable. President Nixon ended the gold standard, turning the dollar into pure faith. Stage 3, deficit spending became permanent. Taxes could no longer cover expenses, so Washington borrowed, first billions, then trillions. And when borrowing wasn't enough, Stage 4 began: money printing. From 2008's financial crisis to the pandemic of 2020, the presses never stopped. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet exploded from $800 billion to $9 trillion. More money was created in a decade than in all previous history combined. Stage 5 followed:
Inevitable inflation. Prices surged, wages lagged, and the illusion of endless wealth began to crack. Now the world is entering stage 6, loss of confidence. Nations that once begged for dollars are building systems to live without them. China cuts its treasury holdings. Russia dumps the dollar entirely. BRICS countries settle trade in local currencies. Global reserves, once 73% in dollars, have fallen below 55%, and the decline accelerates. The privilege that built America's prosperity now threatens to erase it. The world is quietly preparing for a future where the dollar is just another currency, not the currency. And like every empire before it, the fall won't begin with a war. It will begin when the world stops believing.
Across 6 centuries of history, every empire has marched through the same 8 stages, an economic life cycle as precise as the orbit of a planet. Stage 1 is dominance, when a nation earns global trust through power, innovation, or wealth. Portugal discovered new worlds, Spain mined silver, Holland built banks, Britain mastered industry, and America commanded gold. Each began with real strength, earned through productivity and courage. But stage 2 always follows, overextension. Power breeds ambition, ambition breeds debt, and soon the empire finds itself defending more than it can afford. The map glows with influence, but the treasury bleeds. Then comes stage 3, deficit spending. Leaders promise stability while borrowing from the future, assuring citizens that the debt will never matter. It always does. Stage 4 is money printing, the quiet surrender. When taxation and borrowing fail, governments create wealth out of nothing, flooding markets with paper and hope. Stage 5, inflation. Prices rise, trust falls, and the citizens who once felt rich begin to feel trapped. Stage 6, loss of confidence. Foreign nations start looking elsewhere, investors hedge, trade shifts. Confidence, once the strongest pillar, turns fragile overnight. Then comes stage 7, alternatives emerge. A new power rises with a stronger currency, a cleaner balance sheet, and a story the world wants to believe. It begins slowly, quietly, then spreads. The old empire denies it's happening, but denial doesn't stop gravity. Finally, stage 8, collapse. The currency that once defined global trade becomes just another name in the history books. Borrowing becomes impossible. Inflation turns inward instead of global. The standard of living falls, and the privilege of power dissolves. It's not random, it's not emotional. It's the rhythm of history repeating with mathematical precision. Every empire believes it can escape the pattern, and every empire learns the same lesson. Confidence is the most valuable currency on earth, and once it's gone, nothing can replace it. The pattern has spoken 5 times before, and it's whispering again now. The US dollar, once the unshakable symbol of power, has reached its 81st year as the world's reserve currency. That's almost exactly the historical average before collapse. Portugal's real lasted 80 years, Spain's silver, 110, the Dutch guilder, 80, the British pound, 224. Each thought it was exceptional, each believed the rules no longer applied, and each fell exactly the same way. The United States now stands at stage 6, loss of confidence, with stages 7 and 8 waiting just beyond the horizon. Capital is moving, quietly but relentlessly. Nations are trading outside the dollar system. New alliances are forming. BRICS is building its own reserve mechanisms. The Middle East is pricing oil in other currencies. Digital assets, gold-backed systems, and central bank digital currencies are rising. The world is no longer asking when the dollar will fall. It's preparing for what comes after. Once confidence breaks, the timeline accelerates. Britain lost its status in just 26 years. The dollar may last another decade, maybe 2, but the pattern has never been merciful. When stage 7 begins, alternatives become irresistible. Trade shifts, demand evaporates, and the empire that once printed money to rule the world discovers that printing no longer works. Stage 8 follows with brutal clarity, collapse. Borrowing becomes impossible, inflation turns inward instead of global, and the standard of living erodes faster than anyone believed possible. The reserve currency that powered a century of prosperity becomes a relic, and the privilege that built the modern world vanishes. Maybe America believes it's different. Maybe technology or power will rewrite the rules. But history has never spared the arrogant. The same illusion has ended every empire before it, the belief that the pattern won't repeat. But it always does. Because empires don't fall when their enemies attack. They fall when their money dies. And when it dies, everything built upon it dies too. Subscribe if you want to understand how financial empires rise, rule, and collapse before history repeats itself one last time.